back, or welcome for the first time for the new faces in the room, to the second day of the conference on the global regulation of nanotechnologies. Again, just a reminder on the housekeeping matters for those attorneys in the room who want continuing legal education credit. The sign-up sheet is in the back there. And there are also some written materials that summarize some of the background legal documents on nanotechnology, sort of corresponding to each of the panels. So I think we have some extra copies. So if anybody's interested, feel free to grab one of those packets at the end of the session. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the panelists to this fourth panel on building a coherent transnational framework for the regulation of nanotechnologies. The panel will address international cooperation mechanisms that governments and non-governmental actors have engaged in to address nanotech regulation across borders. From informal harmonization of domestic rules to collaboration in international organizations or informal networks of corporations and NGOs sort of acting transnationally, there are many ways to develop a nanotech governance across borders. The panelists will present a range of those activities, and we're very fortunate to hear it from the mouth of those who are really directly and personally involved in those international cooperation processes. First, Professor Gary Marchant from Arizona State University will present an overview of the different types of international and transnational cooperation mechanisms that currently exist. Gary Marchant is the Lincoln Professor of Emerging Technologies at the Law and Ethics at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. He's also a Professor of Life Sciences at ASU and Executive Director of the ASU Center for Law, Science, and Innovation. Professor Marchant has a PhD in genetics from the University of British Columbia, a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government, and a law degree from Harvard. He's written very broadly on environmental law, risk assessment, and risk management, and more specifically on the legal and ethical aspects of nanotech regulation in the or governance, I should say, in the international realm. We will then hear from Mr. Dae-Young Park. Mr. Park will talk about the formal and informal government collaborations involving a number of Asian countries, in particular Korea, China, Japan, Taiwan, and also cooperation between these countries and the US and the EU in particular. Mr. Park is the managing partner of Young and Global Partners, a consulting firm, and the Secretary General of the Korea Environmental Council in Europe, based in Brussels. He has extensive experience in analyzing and advising on environmental health and safety legislation in those countries that I mentioned before. And he's been actively playing a gateway role, really, between European and Asian policymakers and corporate decision makers on those issues. He has also been a member of the ASTM Committee E56 on nanotechnologies. You might remember yesterday it was Chin Pham who talked to us about ASTM and the various activities they were involved in. He himself had been involved in it, Mr. Park as well. Next, Jeff Morris will discuss what progress has been made on the conversions between regulatory approaches in the European Union and the US, and these countries' involvement also in other intergovernmental fora that work on nanotech regulation. Jeff Morris is the EPA's National Program Director for Nanotechnology, and he's responsible for managing the EPA's nanomaterials research program. He also leads the U.S. delegation to the OECD's Working Party on Manufactured Nanomaterials, and he co-chairs the Working Party's Test Guidelines Steering Group. So really, again, a direct actor in those international cooperation mechanisms at various levels. He has been with EPA for 18 years, and previously he served as director of the EPA's Office of Science Policy. Finally, Gabby Eigenmann will present a number of international instruments for nanotech governance, in particular the work of the International Chemicals Conference on the SciChem, another thing that has already been mentioned yesterday, so we'll hear a lot more about it today. She currently, she also will talk about the experiences drawn from the work of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, ITAR, and the OECD, where she also contributes on this issue of nanotechnologies. Ms. Eigenmann is the Principal Officer for International Chemicals and Waste Policies in the International Affairs Division of the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. She currently represents Switzerland in international negotiations on chemicals and waste management policies with the strategic approach to international chemicals management, SICHEM. And also she represents Switzerland in 3 chemicals and waste management conventions, as the Basel Convention, the Rotterdam Convention, and the Stockholm Convention. She's responsible for the international aspects of nanotechnology and manufactured nanomaterials, including the possible future international governance structure on those emerging issues. I will ask each speaker to limit their presentations to about 12 minutes so that we have ample time for discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to Gary.
Yeah. Thanks, Sonia, for organizing such an interesting conference. I thought the discussion so far has been really interesting, and I think putting particularly a focus on a transnational angle is really important because obviously we're living in a global economy, and I think we've learned some lessons from some previous technologies that if we don't sort of look at some of the international implications, we're going to run into a lot of problems later on. So what I want to do is sort of just talk from a very general level sort of how we might sort of try and coordinate international responses. And Sonia used several words there that are important distinctions of cooperation, of coordination, of harmonization, are all sort of different levels of international interaction to try and have consistent regulations. And there's a number of arguments why it would be nice to have consistent international regulations. One is that we have a lot of international trade of products that are made in one company and sold in others, and so to meet similar standards. That a lot of companies in this industry have facilities in many different countries, and so it'd be nice if they have some consistent requirements in terms of workplace safety and warning labels and things like that. Sometimes nanomaterials can cross national boundaries. We don't want trade fights, and we also don't want to prevent, we want to prevent risk havens or race to the bottom of the idea that people have to sort of compete to attract industry by having less stringent standards. And then also just an economy of scale, there's a tremendous challenge in regulating these technologies to be able to share some of the testing and scientific analysis between different countries would actually save resources. So there's a number of reasons why, just going into it, it'd be nice to have some kind of international cooperation or coordination. There's some arguments maybe against it too. I mean, the issue of maybe it's nice to try a lot of different approaches in different parts of the world, sort of laboratories of democracy to try different things. There are also maybe real significant differences in how people perceive risks and so on in different societies, so maybe we don't want the same standards. But I think that the arguments for harmonization, to the extent we can do it, really are stronger, and therefore it'd be a good goal to shoot for to try and harmonize. And again, I think the lessons we learned from GM Foods, where particularly the U.S. and Europe have adopted very different standards, and without saying one's right and one's wrong, the point is they're both entrenched in their point of views, and it's going to be very hard to change that now. And it's resulting in just tremendous inefficiencies and problems around the world, restrictions in trade, all kinds of uncertainty and confusion for companies, all kinds of recalls and embargoes costing billions of dollars. Some of the litigation bears, I don't know if you've been following that, where they're getting $1 million judgments against them on a weekly basis because of something that caused no real harm, but just because of the economic harm that resulted from the different standards and the enforcement of those different standards. So liabilities, big shortage of food, of animal feed in the EU because the soybeans we're growing here now have gone to a new level of genetic modification that isn't improved in Europe, and so they can't import our animal feed. Disincentives for companies to develop products, for countries to grow products because of different standards, and then actual formal litigation essentially in the WTO, all causing all kinds of problems. There's a great book recently written about this, talking about this dispute and saying how Europe and U.S. have long time been allies, and yet we've brought these two allies into conflicts, even though that we have this long history of working together. And it's developed into one of the most bitter and intractable transatlantic and global conflicts, resisting efforts at resolution in bilateral networks in all these different ways. And it's basically, the conclusion of this book is it's probably not going to get better on this issue. We've basically got so entrenched it would be politically difficult for either country to back down. And so, we're going to have more decades of fighting and inefficiency about this because we started off differently. And again, if we could have had some kind of more harmonization up front, we would have avoided a lot of problems and a lot of economic loss and a lot of work for lawyers and so on. So it'd be nice if we could do it differently with nanotechnology. Francis Fukuyama wrote an article basically says, that's good. We do need to coordinate internationally in a globalized world, but we start first with national regulation and then move to international. And I think that's a wrong view, that's exactly what happened with GM. I mean, the idea is each country adopted their own regulations, and then we're going to try and harmonize them in some way. But it's very difficult to do that once you have on the books inconsistent regulations, because neither country wants to seem to be backing down and conforming with the other side. So how do you move from a situation where you have different regulations with different assumptions and different requirements to a harmonized way is very difficult. So I think it'd be nice to do it up front. And that's sort of what we have this opportunity to do with nanotechnology. Because we don't have a lot of unique regulations in place yet, because it's new to everybody, there's sort of a real opportunity here, a window, to try and harmonize as much as we can now before we start adopting the national regulations. And it's interesting, somebody mentioned yesterday, we have a database online at ASU of all the different national regulations, and so we're tracking those, and we see, up until very recently, there's a real similarity in what a lot of the governments are deciding and thinking about when they look at it at nanotech. They're dealing with the same issues of, is this new versus old? What are the gaps in their existing regulations? And coming to very similar type of conclusions mostly. And so it seems to us that there's a real sort of window right now to try and harmonize our international regulation. The problem is that normally, you would think, well, we adopt then a treaty or agreement, and that just doesn't seem to be on the cards anytime soon. As we've seen, for example, with climate change, negotiating a formal international treaty is extremely difficult, resource intensive, all kinds of different things you have to take into account, and it's very difficult to do. And I just don't think there's enough priority given to nanotech at this point, because we don't have the dead bodies, we don't have that urgency that governments are going to put the major commitment of time and resources needed to negotiate a formal treaty anytime in the next few years. So we're really talking about then some more informal type of mechanisms beyond sort of international treaties. And so I have a colleague I work with, Ken Abbott, who's sort of the guru on what the term he's termed as transnational new governance, which is sort of an idea that a lot of scholars are looking at, of basically moving away from some of these hard law treaties to more sort of what is called soft law, which has been a concept around a long time in international law, where it's basically you can sometimes have standards or requirements, but they're not enforceable. So you're setting some substantive goals that people should be trying to shoot for, but they're not enforceable. And then the other aspect of it is it's not just government. Government's a very important participant of this, but it also involves industry, it involves NGOs, it involves sort of networks of different people who have an interest in this working together in some kind of more cooperative way, often led by government, but government not the only player. So it's not sort of the top-down traditional governance or international treaties approach. And this idea is being very successful in a lot of different areas around the world outside of nanotechnology, and finance and environmental issues. It's being used in a lot of different contexts right now with varying degrees of success. But it's something that there's a lot of interest in, a lot of enthusiasm as we recognize some of the limitations of traditional hard law approaches. And so it seems like nanotech is an ideal candidate to try some of these kind of approaches. And just some of the benefits of them is basically voluntary and cooperative. It's reflexive. It can be adopted and revised relatively quickly, we hope. You can try many different approaches simultaneously, unlike a treaty where you have sort of the one requirement and that's it, the one instrument. You can have a lot of different things at once here, trying them out, experimenting. And then over time, you can sort of gradually harden these into more formal regulatory or treaties. These aren't without their limitations. There's some problems with them. The fact that they aren't enforceable can cause problems. There's a risk, perception of whitewashing or greenwashing, that these are just sort of superficial things that make it look like something's being done. There's problems sometimes of who gets to participate and limitations on that. We hope these are flexible and really adaptable, but sometimes they turn out to be very difficult to actually get in place and take a lot longer than people thought. If you have different requirements, there's a confusion and overlap. For example, in synthetic biology right now, there's 3 different codes of conduct out there, international codes of conduct. And so how, if you're a company in that industry, which one are you supposed to comply with? So it causes a lot of confusion because there isn't sort of an official treaty. and there's somewhat less legitimacy to these than traditional laws. So these aren't things panaceas, but there's a lot, I think, going for them. And the model at ASU we've worked out is sort of the idea that I think a lot of other groups, including Diana Bowman's work she's been doing and others, is sort of this gradual implementation, that if we can at least start off and get these going now, we can learn from them and gradually, what we call sort of harden them into more traditional regulations. So that might be the nice sort of roadmap to try and follow. And if we were to do that, we sort of look in steps. And the first step, and sort of most important to start with, is basically to have both regulators and other interested parties talking to each other at an international level more. And there's a number of sort of interesting things that have been set up in the nano area. Probably the two most important are OECD and the ICCM process. And we're fortunate in this session to have experts who are involved in those, who are going to talk to those in a lot of detail. And I think those are very promising, so I'm not going to say more about those, except that they are sort of this model of getting people talking together, not to adopt international standards, but if they understand what each other is dealing with some of the problems together, then there's hopefully more likelihood we're going to end up with very consistent standards than if we sort of all just sort of go off and do it ourselves. There's some other models out there. The Transnational Economic Council between the EU and US has identified nanotech as one of their priorities to talk about, trying to have consistent regulation. International Dialogue on Responsible Research and Development of Nanotech is something started by an NGO here, the Meridian Institute, and they've had 3 of these meetings of regulators from a whole bunch of different countries who get together and sort of just talk about what they're doing and what they could do similarly. There's now been 3 of these meetings. It's sort of a little bit ad hoc, it seems. Like the second one was organized, I think, by Japan, the third one by the EU. It's unclear to me, at least, if there's going to be a 4th one. The International Conference on Harmonization is a really nice sort of model of how this could maybe work in a more formalized way. This is in the drug industry, where basically the FDA and their equivalents from the EU and Japan meet regularly with the representatives of the industry groups from those that sector, and they basically talk about common issues and develop these frameworks that then can be adopted in each other's country. There isn't much of a role for NGOs in that. That's one of the limitations, but at least it's sort of a structured, regular meeting place, and nanotech is now one of the issues they've started to talk about in that context, specifically in the drug context. But that could be an interesting, more formalized model that these can move to. And maybe the OECD, and Jeff's going to talk about that, is sort of moving towards that. So that's, I think, the first step is talking with each other, knowing what each other's doing, sharing information can, I think, lead to a more consistent regulatory approach in different countries. The next step, which we're also got some interesting initiatives on, is basically to try and set some substantive standards or goals that are international, that aren't binding like treaties, but which companies can sort of shoot for. And again, we have a number of initiatives on this. We had a good talk yesterday about these various standard-setting organizations. It's interesting that they've sort of evolved over the last decade or so from basically setting technology standards and specifications and consistency standards to much more sort of quasi-regulatory standards. So as you noticed yesterday, some of the standards on environmental health and safety management, that sort of quasi-regulatory function that these standard-setting organizations are stepping up and filling that gap until we have regulations in place. And again, those are international, and so a company all around the world can follow that sort of consistent standard. DuPont and EDF have come up with an interesting model, the NanoRisk framework, that again is deliberately designed to be international in scope, and it is being looked at from companies and countries all around the world. The Responsible Nano Code, developed mostly out of Europe and Britain, it has, again, shooting for an international some sort of basic steps that companies can take. And again, none of these are mutually exclusive. They can all be done. It was mentioned yesterday that the EU has a code of conduct. There's a group in Europe that's created a risk management certification program. The Chemical Industry's Responsible Care program, and a number of other industry and company standards, where basically these are non-regulatory, but they're setting sort of a goal that companies can shoot for, so there's something you can sort of follow at an international level until there is some kind of more formal agreement. So I think that's sort of the second step, and that's also going forward. So there's been a lot of activity in the nano area because of this. Another step, one that I've been suggesting, is maybe that we should also think about some kind of international scientific assessment body, similar to the IPCC in the climate change problem. I've been getting some bad press lately, but it's still been a fairly successful model to say what we really do and don't know about the science in this area. And so countries and governments and agencies can all sort of go from a common sort of scientific base that has the credibility to base their decisions on. and really tries to work through with all the best scientific minds we can muster from around the world what we do know and what we don't, and what we can say with any kind of certainty. So something like that could be another sort of incremental next step that I think could provide a lot of value. And then something we've written about a couple articles is maybe, if we were ever to move to more formal regulatory things, to use a framework convention model that's worked quite well in the stratospheric ozone context and tobacco, a little bit less successfully, but still somewhat in the climate change area. Basically adopting a structure that doesn't have a lot of substantive teeth in it yet, to start with, to bring countries on board, to create an institution, to create an annual meeting of the parties, to create some kind of scientific assessment body, to have some few core common understandings of technology sharing and so on. And so it's not threatening to anybody. We're not putting in place the substantive requirements yet, but we're setting up a process to build a working relationship, to build an institution. And then over time, you can add in a protocol with the substantive requirements as people, as we know more and we've developed these working relationships. So as we wrote in one of our articles, this allows states to put in place activities and procedures designed to reduce uncertainty about a problem, and then to act incrementally to address that problem of particular aspects as their knowledge and understanding grow. Politically, the substantive weakness of this original framework convention actually helps to attract the broadest public possible participation, even if the commitment of some of the participants is weak or even sincere to begin with. But as the process unfolds, the aim typically is to enmesh the participants in a process of social learning that will lead to accept stronger commitments commensurate with the evolving understanding of the problem. So this idea of a framework convention, not this year, but in the future, may be another first step. And finally, I just want to say that at the domestic level, it's very hard to regulate as well. There's a lot of uncertainties, a lot of problems with adopting regulations for nanotech right now. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have any, but I think the idea of sort of any kind of comprehensive domestic regulation is still years away. And at most, we're going to have some incremental steps for the next few years. And some of those were talked about yesterday for a variety of reasons, some of which were talked about yesterday, like the huge uncertainties, the lack of enforceable definition, how fast the technology is moving, all of these, which also sort of is interesting because it suggests that maybe some of these soft law models, even if you're looking at just a domestic approach, might also be important for there. And so you're sort of now getting this convergence at sort of the international, national level that, regardless of which level you look at, sort of these soft law governance models may be a very important role to play, at least in the interim. And that then, again, is another sort of indirect argument for an international approach. Since we're going that way anyhow, and this is where, at the international level, these soft law approaches are particularly successful and effective, that's yet another argument then to maybe think about looking at a more international scope. And so I think it's a fairly positive look that there is so many interesting initiatives out there and so much going on. And some of my colleagues in the panel will be talking in a lot more detail about those. So thank you.
Yes. No pointer? Okay. Okay.
No. Do you want to use this one, or do you want to use the no, that's okay. Here you go.
Because so I would like to see my slide, and I need to point out some part when I'm doing speaking. So in my presentation, what I would like to do is that I would like to connect what we have been discussing yesterday and what we are discussing today. And also, in particular, so during this conference, we are discussing global governance and global regulation. But the problem is that we have to, when we mention global regulation, then first and foremost, we have to know what is the scale of global regulations we are meaning. So in my presentation, what I have done is that first and foremost, we are approaching this nanotechnology from environmental health and safety perspective. And also, as we all know, nanotechnology is an enabling technology, which means that highly likely nanotechnology is going to be regulated media-specific regulations. So, as we know, like in particular chemical regulations or health and safety regulations. So I'm going to show you what is the global status of these environmental health and safety regulations, and there's also what is the dynamics of this global environmental health and safety regulation regulatory changes, which is happening each month, actually impact every day. And also, I will show you the global EHS regulatory risks which companies are facing, because yesterday we had some discussion between companies and companies and government and some other academics. But I think there was some missing point that companies are facing enormous environmental and safety regulatory challenges every day, and also it's very difficult. So I would like to show that kind of skills. And also, as I said, nanotechnology as a enabling technology, it has a huge amount of impact throughout the regulations. So I just take an example of chemical regulations in Asia and what is happening about the chemical regulations in Asia, likely in relation to nanotechnologies. And also I will be concluding by discussing global governance and global regulations through like how we can make some intergovernmental cooperation on this matter. So this is the global status and trends of EHS regulations as of July 2009. So as you can, I cannot use pointer. Anybody has a pointer? No. Yeah, thank you. So I explained it. This is the status of a global, each country's environmental health and safety regulations. And so as you can see here, China, they already have around selected 620 environmental and safety regulations. So which means that when we think about harmonization of global environmental and safety regulation, that means that it's not going to impact the whole nanotechnology, but there is that bulk of environmental and safety regulations in China. And also France, around 600. There are really enormous amount of environmental and safety regulations throughout the world. So that's why global governance, global regulation, we need very careful and really time-consuming or huge amount of effort to understand them. And also, after my presentation, in the later part, you will see how ridiculous at times that a country is regulating certain part of regulations. So this is the global dynamics about environmental and safety regulatory changes. In fact, each month we see around 450 environmental health and safety policy and regulatory development. So as you can, this one is a one-year trend between July 2008 and July 2009. As you can see, in case of European Union, there is around 270 environmental and safety regulatory changes each year. But this is, again, selected one which may impact companies, like corporate operations and product. So China as well, we see around 130 regulatory changes, which has some significant impact on the corporate company operations and products. So it's really dynamic and is moving every day. So we have to see, when we think about the nanotechnology, then we have to see this status and dynamics of global environmental and safety regulations throughout the world. So this is the status of April 2010. Actually, this is just I took this slide from our internal database. This is the challenges that companies are facing as of April 2010 in the past, like April, March, and February, only 3 months. So as you can see here, you can see huge amount of regulations coming from throughout the world each month. And regulatory index 5, this one is the highest risk, and regulatory each has risk index 1 is like a minimum risk. So these are the environmental and safety regulatory challenges coming throughout the world, impacting companies. So we have been discussing nanotechnology and global regulations, but this is the challenges that companies are facing. So there are some parts are related to the nanotechnology, but I will be going to that point. But there is that amount of enormous challenges coming from throughout the world to the companies or to the industries. So next one, I'm taking more specific example about chemicals. So in case of chemicals, during 2008 and 2009, we have seen around 580 chemical regulations throughout the world. In fact, mostly those on average, this means around 44 chemical regulations each month throughout the world. And also, as you see in this from this pie chart, you can see that around 42% of chemical regulations during 2008 and 2009 came from the EU. Because this is simply because of GHS, globally harmonized system on the classification and labeling of chemicals, plus REACH. Because many people are thinking that REACH is a European regulation, so it's directly applicable to the member state. However, even though it is directly applicable to the member state, they have to amend or incorporate REACH element into their existing chemical regulations. So because of that, there have been huge amount of regulatory changes during 2008 and 2009 in the European member states. And also around 19% or 20% comes from APEC, because I think yesterday we had already mentioned the global convergence of regulations. It is indeed, when there's a European regulations come, in particular chemical regulation comes, Asian countries and other parts of the world, they have immediately see what is happening in other parts of the world. So they have been benchmarking those new regulatory trends, and they have been changing their domestic regulations. So this is likely happen with the nano regulations as well. So now I'm coming to the Asian side. So this is emerging but missing, because when I look at mainly chemical regulations, because I'm mainly discussing environmental health and safety regulations, there are two pieces mainly. Here in EU side, I only measure CLP stands for classification and labeling of chemicals. So that we call it CLP regulation. And REACH is, as you may know, that REACH stands for, it's better to say, this is a new chemical regulations from European Union. And as you can see, here there are some discussions about nanomaterials under REACH. But currently there is no specific provisions yet. And also China, this one is more, in the next slide, you will see how ridiculous it is. So China has this safe production law is in US is like Occupational Safety and Health Act. In case of new chemical regulation, is a chemical regulation, which China just adopted in 2003. That was the first Chinese chemical regulation, modern type of regulation in 2003. So later slide, I will explain how it is going to impact the global governance or global regulations or the global cooperation. Same in Japan. There is an industrial safety and health law and Japan chemical control law. Again, there is no mentioning about the nanotechnology yet. It's the same in Korea. So mostly, but they do have a framework. Fortunately, they do have a framework. They can control existing and new chemicals. But what is important is that here, probably the same in US. In case of European Union, they had the first chemical regulation at the European Union in 1968. In case of US, 1976, Japan, 1973. So this is kind of some first modern type chemical regulation, which they start to distinguish between new and existing chemicals. In case of Korea, they introduced in 1990s. China, they introduced 2003, which means that there is around, with Korea, there is around 14 years difference. With China, between Europe and China, it has around like a 30, more than 30 years difference. This is an enormous difference. That's why there are a lot of promotional policy and regulations promote development of nanotechnology. However, from the environmental health and safety perspective, we cannot expect the European level of like a risk prevention regulations or policies in China. And again, this is very notable point, because there is ongoing debate in European Union, in particular European Commission, about this nanomaterials I think many of you may know that ROHS. ROHS stands for Restriction of Hazardous Substances in Electronics. Now we are discussing in the European Parliament a revision of this ROHS, and nanomaterial is one of the key issues that we are discussing. Whether we would like to include, in particular, nanosilver in one of the hazardous substances under ROHS, which, as I said, they are already discussing it. In case of this one, this cosmetic product regulation, which was adopted in 2009, 30 November 2009, this one is the first ever European regulation which legally define nanomaterials. So now we have legal definition of nanomaterials under the law. So I will show you that. And also this one will enter into force in 2013. So this is, I think, very good benchmarking point for all of us, because now, finally, we have legal definitions. So I'm going to explain these all strange characters, so don't worry. So we are mentioning about the global regulations and global approach. However, this is, I just take an example of definition of chemicals in China, Japan, Korea, and European Union. And also please consider the time differences, which I showed in the previous slide. China, as I said, they had this new chemical regulation in 2003, and they have amended in 2010. So this definition comes from 2010 version. And China, in these new chemical regulations, they do not have a definition about chemicals. So it's very strange. In chemical regulations, there is no definition of chemicals, but they have a definition about new chemical. So this is this word directly I just take from copy and paste from the law, and this first five characters stands for new chemicals. So they defined new chemicals, but there is no definition about chemicals. And how they define chemical is that new chemical means chemicals which are not entered in the inventory of existing chemicals. That's the definition of new chemicals in China. So in case of Japan, so I think it's more or less internationally adopted, internationally acceptable definitions about chemicals, which means that chemical means element or compound which obtained through chemical reactions. That's the Japanese definition. But they are excluding from these definitions, they are excluding radioactive substances or poisonous and deleterious substances and some pharmaceuticals and drugs. Those are excluded from the chemical regulations in Japan. In case of Korea, they have it's very similar definition, but the Korea, they define chemicals as like an element and compound obtained from chemical reactions, plus substances abstracted or refined, some substances from substances in the natural status. So it's already, because this is likely happen when they start define nanomaterials or nanotechnology in their media-specific regulations. So global regulation, global governance, global harmonization is going to be very, very big challenges and really tough challenges. In case of European Union, they have really plenty and long, detailed definitions. Yeah, so I'm almost there. And also, as I mentioned, the cosmetic product regulations was adopted in European Union in November 2009. This is the first ever definition about nanomaterials in regulation. So I think if there is a company representative from another industry, not cosmetic industry, you can already start thinking how this definition may impact your product or operations. So this is a very good benchmarking point, but European Union, in a sense, they were very reasonable because they said because they are seeking harmonization of definitions at the international level. So if there is ongoing or another adopted international definitions on nanomaterials, they will be keep modifying it. So it's a very regional approach in a sense. So I'm almost at the end of my presentation. There is regarding international and regional framework or regional cooperation mechanism in Asia, in particular in case of China, Japan, Korea, this TEMM stands for Tripartite Environmental Ministers Meeting, which Chinese, Japanese, Korean Ministry of Environmental Ministers are meeting each year. So this is a very good forum. They are discussing how we can coordinate our environmental policy and regulations, so which potentially impact industry or the natural environment involving China, Japan, and Korea. So this is a very good mechanism that they can also handle nanotechnologies, because if they are going to regulate these nanomaterials through their media-specific regulations, but they have not yet discussed nanotechnologies through this forum, through this meeting, but they have been discussing chemicals regulations seriously. And also as we know, there is an APEC chemical dialogue. So APEC is Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. There is an APEC chemical dialogue, which they continuously exchange information about chemical regulations and other chemical-related regulations. So there is this forum. So when we go to APEC level, then already we can get Taiwan and US, and also as I already continuously mentioned, there's an OECD, which easily involve Japan, Korea, and European Union. There is a connection with the European Union and Japan and Korea through OECD. And also, as we know, OECD have been sponsoring a lot of risk assessment of nanomaterials since 2008 or 2009. So, and also there's these international mechanisms at the international level. So there is this kind of mechanism, but not yet they are discussing about nanotechnologies or nanomaterials. So this is my last slide, Sonia. So I'm finished. And as you can see, from my perspective, in a sense, I'm slightly skeptical about what is doing. But I cannot see Jeff, but I'm somewhat skeptical what national governments are doing at times, because domestically, at times, it's a global communication. It could be easy, but I see more problems domestically, because Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Labor, and other ministries, because they have a separate jurisdictions over separate environmental health and safety regulations. So they do not want to communicate, or it's very, very difficult to make them work together. So globally, we can communicate through SciChem or ICCM or ISO, but probably the serious problem could be at the domestic level about, to do a real cooperations. So that's my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, well, this is going to be a description of the OECD's work, but I think more importantly, it's going to be a story of transformation. And it's going to be a story of transformation from a group of nations and stakeholders who've operated for decades under a particular chemical regulation paradigm and is shifting to something different that I'm going to describe. These are the 30 members of the OECD, and I don't think I need to describe the OECD to you all. It came out of the Marshall Plan and set up to advance the rebuilding of Europe after World War II, and focuses on a number of economic development issues, but for our purposes here, it also focuses on chemical regulation and coordination of that
regulation across member nations. So within that structure of looking at how we accept data across member nations for chemicals, the notion of whether nanomaterials fit within that paradigm rose to the OECD back in 2005. So a year later, the OECD decided to form a working party of manufactured nanomaterials that would look at, in the first instance, how nanomaterials fit within the mutual acceptance of data paradigm within which the OECD works. And just to explain that in a minute, essentially the mutual acceptance of data provision means that if a study in one member nation is conducted using OECD test guidelines, that study must be accepted for review in another member nation. So they're like mini treaties then that form around those test guidelines. So the United States took up the chair the first 3 years. It's now chaired by the European Commission and coordinates with a number of bodies, including ISO. The participants include not only the 30 member nations, but other groups as well. And we thought this was very important because, particularly if you look at the observer nations, these are nations that are very interested in producing nanomaterials, marketing them, commercializing them, and therefore it just seemed to make sense to us to bring them in. So the term observers is a bit misleading, as you'll see. They're called observers because they're not member nations, but in fact they are full participants in many ways in this working party. And they include not only other nations, but also NGOs, business, animal rights activists, ISO TC229, labor groups, etc. I want to start with the test guideline effort because this is where the shift, this transformation, I think, in the paradigm began to occur. Sort of the first job that we set up as a working party was to look at these nearly 100 test guidelines that exist for industrial chemicals to see whether they would work for manufactured nanomaterials, to decide whether we needed new test guidelines for nanomaterials or how we would amend the existing ones if necessary for nanoscale materials. So we went through those guidelines and discovered that, well, in fact, most of them would work just fine. Some would have to be amended, and in fact, we were missing guidelines entirely for some areas, particularly with regard to physicochemical properties. But there were a number of really sticky issues that we recognized that just in terms of, for example, taking a nanoparticle and putting it in solution, and then let's say water for a fish test, where you would normally put a chemical in water, see how much it takes to kill half the fish, and that gives you some sort of level to use for that particular test, and that's according to OECD guidelines. For a number of these materials, you can't get them into solution easily. You can't suspend them, so you can't perform the test. Well, this obviously has tremendous implications for governance and regulatory mutual acceptance of data for that particular material. That's why we started to look deeper into this and what its implications were. And here, I think, is where we sort of began to move out of the traditional chemical regulation paradigm and begin to change into something else. Because we recognized that if we were going to really see how we could develop testing schemes that were acceptable across nations for nanomaterials, we'd have to understand those materials themselves. And we recognized that to understand materials meant to actually do some testing, some research on them, trying out the OECD guidelines, seeing if they would work, and if not, what to do about that. And we recognized that the only way to do that was to bring nations together to share the burden in performing these tests. So we decided we would do a couple of phases of testing, and I'm really going to focus on the phase one. And This is a list of the types of tests we recognize that we would have to perform. And I'm not going to go through these, but the point is that these are the tests that a government would use, certainly my agency would use, to test a nanomaterial for safety. So actually, these are regulatory science. These are regulatory tests. Now, the important transformational issue of this is that we had governments, we had industry, we had NGOs. Everybody had to agree that we were going to do research, sort of trial and error testing using these endpoints on specific materials, and at the same time not have any regulatory implications for this cooperative testing. So you can imagine if you've got business and NGO sitting in a room with you, and you can say, well, we're going to do these sets of tests. NGOs say, well, you need to add these 3 here. Business says, well, we can't do these 3. Take off 2 of those. And by the way, none of this can be used for regulation, right? And so we all had to agree on that. And here I think we begin to transform from a group of interests who were thinking in the chemical regulation mindset to a group of stakeholders who began to think about governance. And this is where we ended up with this testing program. You'll see down the left-hand side a list of 14 materials that we decided that were the ones who were most likely to be in commerce now or in the near future, the carbon materials, metals, metal oxides, etc. And then across the horizontal, the countries, the groups that agreed to step forward to either lead the testing, contribute to it, or jointly sponsor with other nations. And you can see that we've got cooperation going here. And just to give you a very practical example, Japan had started testing on carbon materials on mammalian toxicology endpoints. We in the U.S. had begun some testing on ecological toxicity endpoints. We said, okay, well, let's test on the same materials, look across, and see what we can learn about those materials, and likewise for the others. So a number of nations, business and industry advisory committee, et cetera, came together to do this testing. So that's underway right now, and so far it's worked out pretty well. But here's where I think it helped us build into other areas. So now that we had transformed from a group that was not thinking just about chemical regulation, but rather trying to understand materials, we begin to broaden out our interest in understanding them in other ways. And it shifted beyond just the sort of the regulatory testing, test guidelines effort to looking at what it means to sustainably develop and use nanomaterials. We held a conference last summer where, in addition to our working party, we brought in people from African nations, from Asia, to talk about people who were involved in more community development type of activities, to broaden the discourse on what sustainability would mean for nanotechnology. And just one example, we talked about water treatment using, I think it was titanium dioxide as a water treatment technology. And the individual who was on our panel from India said, hey, water treatment is great, but can you develop this technology in specific villages to provide jobs for people to employ that technology so that we get sort of that larger benefit? So we begin to broaden out the discourse on what it means for nanotechnology, nanomaterials, and environmental benefit. And this is obviously far afield from industrial chemicals regulation. But I think in terms of a full discourse in governance, it shows what happens when you can bring people together and talk about issues in I guess I call it a non-threatening collaborative environment. I'm not going to talk about these, Gabby is going to, but I just want to point this out that, I don't think that those workshop series where we brought in other groups who hadn't been associated with OECD but were very interested in the developing world could have happened without this OECD energy in the working party. And we have been active supporters and contributors to this. Because I think we've come to realize that there's got to be a center for governance and thinking broadly about what I would call the net benefit of nanomaterials. and it can't just be an OECD. So to the extent that we can provide some sort of catalytic activity to help that happen, that's what this is about. And I'm sure Gabby will talk about the specific workshops that have now occurred in 5 different venues. But I want to wrap up by saying that the OECD's Working Party on Manufactured Nanomaterials began in the way we always begin talking about chemicals. What tests do you need? How are we going to come up with quantitative risk assessments? What's going to be legally defensible? What are the protocols, et cetera, that you're going to need? But I think because the time was right and the place that we were at with nanomaterials early in the development and commercialization curve allowed us the space to think more broadly and to evolve the discussion. And because of that, we've been able to, I think, and I hope, provide a sort of a center of energy for larger thinking on nanomaterial governance, and to recognize that you can't separate out the chemical regulation, the risk science issues from the larger considerations of net social benefit, and that perhaps we've developed a new model, or not developed a new model, perhaps advanced models that consider the 21st century way of looking at chemicals governance. Thanks.
I would also just to thank, first of all, the organizer for inviting me not only to attend this conference, also to give me the opportunity to talk about I would say, a vision of Switzerland, what the international governance structure could look like for nanos. And if I talk about nanos, that term stands for nanotechnology and manufactured nanomaterials. In order to save time, I will just use nano. A short overview of my presentation. I will give a quick definition what we understand on governance, and in particular on what is a nano, what could be a nano, what is a nano governance. Then I will go shortly through several reasons, about 6 reasons why an international governance is needed. It has already been touched by Gary at the beginning, so I will very quickly go through and just emphasize on several which has not been mentioned. Then I will present what is going on currently at international level with respect to resolutions or statements that has been adopted on nanos. And then I will end with giving some examples that I'll go a little bit more in detail of examples for a nano, for a governance structure for addressing nanos. So governance can be defined as a system how actors through institutions and processes identify, address, and solve common problems. So if we talk about a nano governance, this is the political and administrative system established to address problems associated with nanotechnology and manufactured nanomaterials. Why is there a need for an international nano-governance? I think several presenters today have already touched on this issue. I will just emphasize a little bit on the race to the bottom, also on the pooling of competence, and the last point, supporting for the adoption of effective national regulation. That has been mentioned. I go through. Race to the bottom, I just add that because it has been mentioned yesterday as well, that we have to take into consideration the competition, that industries also want to compete, and that should not be done on and despite of environmental protection. So cooperation can really help that industries know what other countries do, and also then adopt protectional measures that they really want, and not the one that they just, I mean, if it should not result that they adapt lower environmental protection as they actually want, because they do not cooperate. Economies of scale, I think, has been very well elaborated already. Also the facilitation of trade and the fair competition that can be enhanced through nano-governments. We see also if we centralize a centralized competence is more professional and more effective. For example, if we have a global research platform that can also really save cost and can make it more efficient, then every county does a little bit. That if we do it at the centralized level, that could really beneficial and also more effective and professional. Then maybe and contradicted view that to one presentator. I think if there is an international, if there are measures at international level or decisions taken at international level, it can help to prioritize certain issues at national level. So that applies not only, for example, for developing country, but also for Switzerland. For us, it's sometimes easy to say, well, that the decision was taken at the international level, and not we, the Swiss government. So it's easier then to really apply and prioritize. So in summary, is there a need for international nano-governance? Yes, for all these 6 reasons we see that the global nano-government structure to address global challenges of nanotechnologies can be really beneficial, and we should not wait to develop it. So what has been done at international level? There has been, at the 6th session of the Intergovernmental Forum on Chemical Safety, it has been also mentioned yesterday by a presenter, the Dhaka statement on nanotechnology has been adopted, and the main message of that statement is that global risk of nanotechnology and of nanos have not been fully addressed, and there is a need to understand, avoid, address, and manage the risk of nanos better. In this statement, this statement also requests some concrete action, like the application of the precautionary principle, also the adoption of a national or even an international code of conduct. Also asked that the relevant information should be open, should be an open source, that it should be accessible for all the countries, and the dialogue on potential benefits and risks should really continue among governments and other stakeholders and should be enhanced. Also, the importance of private-public partnership is mentioned in this statement, and of course the issue of funding is as well addressed, that there is a request for the international community also to fund these kind of activities. Then we have, as already mentioned, the 2nd International Conference on Chemicals Management, which is actually the governing body of CICEM. So that is the relation between strategic approach on international chemicals management. At the first meeting, CICEM has been established, and then the second meeting took place last year in Switzerland. And there, nanos have not only been identified as an emerging and new issue, it has also, a resolution on this has been adopted. It takes up several issues that has been addressed in the statement, in the Dhaka statement. It's maybe a little bit less strong than the Dhaka statement, but also it asked for more research, and also that the information should be shared as soon as they become available, and that upcoming regional and other meetings should be used to enhance this understanding. And within this context, the workshops, the various workshops that have been organized by UNITA in close cooperation with OECD have been launched. Yes, before I go a little bit further, a little bit more to this, talk a little bit more about these workshops. There are two regional cycle resolutions on nanos. One has been adopted in the African region and one in the group of Latin American Caribbean region. There, the messages from the IFC statement and ICCM resolution have been reaffirmed, and also the issue of waste is addressed in that resolution. And I can add that in the group of Latin American Caribbean region, the need for a scientific assessment body, as already mentioned today, has also been raised during the discussion, and that CICOM could probably be a good framework for such a body. As I said, in the context, on the basis of the ICCM2 resolution, this awareness workshop have been conducted in all UN regions. The first round has been done, and the second round is planned to take place this and next year, to go a little bit further, not only raise awareness, but also discuss within the groups what could be really done to address nanos at the national level, and also how could that be related to the international level, and what activities at international level could help to do so. So this second round will start very soon. We have probably this year or next. Yeah, probably this year. We have there are several existing international instruments we could use for a nano governance structure, and one, as has been already mentioned several times, that is the strategic approach for international chemicals management. So what is it? It's a policy framework to promote chemical safety around the world. It has 3 basic documents. I will not really explain what this is, but very important is the global plan of action, where a lot of activities have been stated. And the overall objective is really that by 2020 chemicals are produced and used in a way that minimize significant adverse impacts on human health and the environment. And this goal has been adopted at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. It's not legally binding, CICOM, but politically binding, so it's kind of a soft law, and it asks for a life cycle approach. Why is it suitable, or why could it be a suitable nano-government structure? Well, it's a multi-stakeholder it's a multi-stakeholder forum, and has a multi-sectoral approach. While it was developed, there were not only governments involved, there were also not only Ministry of the Environment, we had also the agriculture sector, we had the industries there, the NGOs were there, the civil society was there. So it's a multi-stakeholder process, and it's also that the meetings that are taking place within this context are still very multi-sectoral. And since nano is not an issue that touches just one specific area, we see that could be a good, CICOM could provide really a good framework. It's dynamic. It has just identified nano as a new emerging issue. It can, and within that approach, as it has a global scope, and it provides a framework for existing instruments. And OECD is one of the participating organizations. So there are also 2 other instruments that could be used to address nano at the international level: the Basel Convention on the Control of Transparent Removements of Hazardous Waste and their Disposal. It has also been mentioned yesterday shortly. Here, I will not enter into the detail, but just stated that it could be an instrument for hazardous waste. But then the issue comes up of definition again: what is hazardous and what's not. So that could provide an instrument. And then the Rotterdam Convention on Prior Informed Consent, that could address several trade issues for several nanoparticles, but probably not for all. We see maybe carbon nanotubes as one that could be addressed through this instrument. These two instruments are legally binding, so it's not a soft law, but it's a legally binding instrument. The Stockholm Convention, also mentioned yesterday, we don't see as a future home for nanos because it's on organic substances. What about using a convention that is going to be negotiated very soon? In fact, this June, the negotiation on a new convention on mercury will start. And why not open this convention for other substances of global concern? Could be an option. Theoretically, it's an option, but politically maybe it could be difficult. And furthermore, the problems and solutions to address nanos and mercury are maybe too different that it could be in one instrument. A separate nano convention may be too early to really see if that is a good option. So, in conclusion, we see nano is really an issue of global concerns that need to be addressed through an international governance structure. This need has been, it's not because of all the reasons at the beginning I was stating. It's a global concern. It has also been addressed during that awareness raising workshops in the different UN regions. Countries have said there is a need for global action. And we have we have a number of existing instruments that offer elements for such a nano-governments, as I said, CICOM, Basel, and the Rotterdam Convention. Thank you very much for
it. And they're really stimulating presentations, and I think we got a very good overview of the many mechanisms that are out there. All right, I already see some questions, so that's great. If we can sort of keep the questions and the answers relatively brief, then we can address more of them, which would be great. And if the panelists can, in the meantime, join back the room. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Karsten Kowalczyk. I'm a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and I'm an economist and have enjoyed yesterday and today tremendously. It's a fantastic conference. I have two brief comments and two brief questions. And I want to start from the last speaker, Ms. Eigenmann. It's a very nice presentation. I just wanted to make the observation that not only is the science very difficult here, we know from economics and from the social sciences how very difficult it is to work even with simple problems of decision making under uncertainty. People just cannot deal with probabilities, even in simple cases, very well. So the order of magnitude of the problem here, and ultimately governance and policy, is truly large. My second comment is to Mr. Morris. My area of expertise is international trade and investment. And in international trade and investment, we often hear about linkages to environmental considerations at the multinational level, at the multilateral level. Your example of India, where you're talking about water treatment and possibly introducing a technology and also solving employment problems, show how the linkage to economic problems can actually work against a solution. I mean, it would be sad, unfortunate, if solving a water problem is going to be tripped up on solving an employment problem. And in economics, we have a long tradition for suggesting that we apply instruments directly at the goals. So sometimes perhaps we do need to try to separate things. I also recognize the political challenges. I have two questions. Mr. Parks, very nice presentation. Very impressed with the data about legislation on chemicals. I'm just wondering about enforcement. We do see, and we've actually seen situations in the environment where say, developing or emerging economies had more legislation in place and more sophisticated legislation in place than high-income countries in certain areas, but the enforcement was not there. So whether you have, for example, the index, the EHS Regulatory Risk Index, whether that is counting laws or whether it also incorporates the consideration of enforcement. And my final, so that's one question, and the other question is to Professor Marchand. It's very, very nice presentation. And I was wondering, you are starting out with the statement of the desirability of harmonization. And it seemed, would it be fair to summarize your presentation by saying that the way to get to harmonization is by not putting in place harmonization for some stretch of that process? That's my final question. Thank you so much.
Shall I answer the question? Actually, indeed, enforcement is really big problem. In particular, we know that China, they are very good at producing regulations, but they are not good at enforcing regulations. But when we calculate the risks, global EHS risks, we usually, from a company perspective, regardless whether the country enforce a regulation or not, we have to manage it. Because one day, if they suddenly enforce it, and if we are not in compliance with a certain regulation, it becomes immediate risk to us. So which means that for the calculation of risk itself, we do not consider enforcement practice, but we just calculate the intrinsic risk of regulations.
I'm not totally sure I understand your question. If you ask, my presumption is we need harmonization, and really what I'm saying is not harmonization in terms of an international treaty or a formal law. Is that what you were getting at?
Thank you. We have the issue on any given day of whether to apply, for example, the same tax rate across different jurisdictions or not. We could apply the same tax rate across different jurisdictions. One could argue that's harmonization. An alternative is to apply different tax rates across different jurisdictions, and then argue that doing so, letting, for example, a tax rate on anything, could be a local issue, and through dynamic processes, economic growth, increased awareness, and so forth and so on, that at some point these tax rates would in fact become harmonized. So you know, I found your presentation very stimulating, and I agree with the tenor of your talk. I think we see even in some integrated economies and societies that we may end up in a long-run equilibrium where there are differences because people may choose to locate with different preferences. They form, in economics, we call this the theory of clubs, which relates to the field of soft law that you're talking about. So I just perhaps to tease a little bit, was wondering, I mean, there's another hard line, which is to say we harmonize on day one, and that's the way we want to go about it. I think you take a more nuanced and politically, in a sense, realistic approach. But I pose that as a question.
I think you're putting your finger right on it. That ideally, it'd be nice to have uniform laws across the world, and that just isn't going to happen in this area. And so I'm really talking about not so much harmonization, but sort of coordination, cooperation. In which case, we're going to tolerate, and maybe it's good to have a little bit of variation. The question is, how much variation can we deal without having trade disputes and other inefficiencies? When you talk about, say, the GM area, I mean, there's some really major cultural differences between Americans and Europeans on food and so on that maybe we need to have different standards, somewhat different. Maybe in nano there aren't such big differences, so we can be closer. But you're right, we're talking about somewhat different, not an exact same language. And then the question is, how much difference can we tolerate without having inefficiencies and yet take into account differences in different places, the different clubs, so to speak. So I think that's a key issue on this whole issue.
Hi, Lee Breckenridge at Northeastern University School of Law. Just to follow up on that last point, it strikes me actually that having many national and even subnational disparities can be crucial to the dynamic of seeing a coordinated system emerge. some of the tension or even the wastefulness, you might say, of having people fighting over different standards can be crucial to pushing that forward. So I certainly thought it was wonderfully presented by everybody here, why it is that we need to strive for international governance. In a sense, even Jeff Morris's presentation highlighted, though, how it is that sub-international entities can help to drive things forward precisely because they have the power to make their own standards separately.
All right, we'll just take another question right away.
Mark Sarner, Carleton University in Canada. It's also on the topic of international harmonization. Something I know from the work with the Canadian government is that the word harmonization has become actually a dirty word that public servants actively try to avoid at all costs, using other words for the same idea. The reason for that is that is precisely the worry that the public has that harmonization is an example of the race to the bottom. And both Gary and Gabi have shown that international conventions could be a protection against the race to the bottom. But I believe the perception is that the harmonization that you propose is precisely an example for the race to the bottom. So I would like you to maybe expand a bit on that to explain how to get around this perception or the problem.
And if we can try to keep the responses fairly brief so we can get to the next questions as well. Thanks.
I don't know.
That's why I'm saying it. It's an impossible answer.
Good point.
Yeah, actually, the point that Mark mentioned is that, in fact, it is maybe really true that international convention it's very difficult to go to the race to the top, because if we go to the race to the top, then developing countries, they will never able to follow it. So there is a tendency, even in the European Union, there's as you know, we have a European expert here. In case of European Union, what they can do is that they can give the minimum threshold. They have to meet this standard, everybody. However, if somebody can, but there is another problem with this issue as well. But the countries are, in a sense, some are free to go further, as you know. They could put some more stringent requirement. However, when somebody, in particular like a Scandinavian country, when they put some more stringent regulation, it becomes deviation from the principle. Then they could have a legal challenges at the WTO or at the European Union level. So it's very difficult issue. However, what companies are approaching is that the minimum standards are provided from the international convention or the European Union level directive or regulations. But what companies are doing is that they meet that minimum standard also, but as a company policy or through the industry association, they put there some what we call self-regulations in order to go further. But that becomes the ethical issues, which is your topic.
Okay, can I make a comment and ask a question? I hope my voice holds out. Gary, you and many other people constantly refer to the problems between the US and the EU on GM. And often the EU is seen as a uniform block of having the same opinion on GM. I can assure you, and you know it does not. And maybe a glimmer of hope was given a couple of weeks ago by the new Commissioner for Health, who wanted to have a dialogue on GM based on science. First time I heard a commissioner talk about science as the basis for a policy, but, you know, maybe we're moving forward in the EU. And that was to the European Parliament, you know, the most opposed group in the EU to GM. So I'm hoping we may see a slow change in the attitudes there. But one of the reasons I think, and again, I think we discussed it yesterday, is why we have this EU opposition to GM is because we didn't have the kind of debate that we're having on nano. It was dictatorial by certain industry groups, and that was seen to be beneficial for everybody because it was beneficial for certain other parts of the world. And this kind of debate on nano, I think, is essential to avoid the type of opposition that developed on GM in Europe and other parts of the world too, but not so vociferously. In terms of all of the conventions and the OECD, which we follow very closely, I belong to the BIAC group there on other areas. I think that the one area that no one's mentioned is food. And the WHO had a meeting last year, in the middle of last year, to try to start to develop some kind of international agreement on the risk assessment and risk management of nano in food. And I wanted to make a comment yesterday evening, but my voice was really disappearing, about the public perception of risk in food. And of course, like many additions to what the public perceives as the natural food system, zero risk is what is required by, in quotes, by the public. And therefore, for nano and for many other chemicals added to food in whatever form, we're taking a more cautious and considered approach, waiting for the science, really waiting, as I said yesterday, for the toxicology to evolve a little more before we start to actually add any nanomaterial, engineered nanomaterial to food. Doesn't mean to say we won't be using new emulsifying techniques, make better ice creams with lower fat, etc. That's already being done. But in terms of engineered nanomaterials, as we, I think, all are talking about, we are waiting for the science to develop. And I think if WHO is not the right governance model for applications in food, I'd like to hear of any other of the models maybe that you've been describing, or perhaps a new model may be required for the applications to the agri-food business. Agriculture I include in the food side as well, because obviously what can be applied to agriculture can go through into the final food stuff. So any comments on whether any of the governance models that you've been talking about would be able to be extrapolated to food? Obviously OECD in terms of the science is, and at least I'm not sure if it is actually, Jeff, but if it isn't, it could be.
If I could start by saying that we in OECD are taking maybe one step back from that question and pursuing the notion of net benefit. So, and that entails looking at the particular use of a material. So, as we heard from Seth Sullivan yesterday, yeah, if quantum dots can transform the way we do lighting, that may be a tremendous benefit for the possible risk of introducing more, say, cadmium or whatever into the environment. Okay, that's one thing. But and likewise, if you're going to maybe allow your food to be fresher in the supermarket for 2 more weeks because you have some sort of nano wrapping, that's a whole nother type of use that brings in a whole nother discourse about what we mean by benefit and how we weigh those benefits with respect to risk. And I think that's where we are in the OECD discussion right now as we explore this notion of sustainability and environment and net benefit, what we mean. And hopefully that type of thinking then can be, I think, superimposed on whatever governance structures we use for foods. But I think you've got to, my view, you've got to start there with that type of thinking.
I just want to add, I mean, I think your point about the biotech is a good one. I think from my reading, you're much more involved in that, obviously, than I am in Europe, is that, there's a recognition in Europe that maybe they blew it on biotech a little bit, that, there's a very important industry that's now pretty much shut out, that the government maybe overreacted, that the industry wasn't enough engaged with the public and maybe just try to impose it, and that the industry needs to do that. Both industry and government need to handle nanotech differently than they did biotech. In terms of international models on food, I mean, I guess I asked you a question. Is Codex involved in this? It seems like Codex is a classic example of a successful soft law approach, and I've never heard anything of them doing on nanotech. Have they been involved in that?
Well, it has been suggested quite recently that Codex may be a model. I think you're absolutely right, Gary. I think it is, and I agree with you, by the way, on the soft law approach. I mean, I spent 20 years as a regulator, and I use the word harmonization frequently. And of course, we failed in getting any harmonization in terms of global food law. But we do have soft law. Codex is now, because of WTO, somewhere in between soft law and hard law. WHO meeting last year was a sort of precursor. I know that we were severely castigated by Angelica Fisher, who ran for WHO, because we didn't supply data. I said, what data? We don't have any data on the application of equipment. Nobody believes it because of all the hype from certain NGOs that we're using lots and lots of nanomaterials already in food, of course, but not. So I think Codex, we can have really good discussions in Codex, as we've been having actually in GM on this methodology, would be a very good one. But it really, I stress, balanced, scientific-based pace. Codex very quickly become politicized, as you know, with some of these emotional issues.
May I add here also that the WHO is involved in the SAICM process. They're also an organization within that. And as I said, SAICM, it's not only for the environment, it's also for protection and human health. So this discussion could also take place within the context of SAICM.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a really good discussion. I know there are more questions out there, so hopefully we can continue the discussion over break, and we'll reconvene at, let's try to aim for 11:20 for the next panel. Thank you very much.